Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Justice, and today we're delving back into my coverage on the 28 Days Later franchise with 28 Weeks Later. If you missed my last video, I covered the first installment of this franchise, so I will leave a link to that in the description right down below. But with that out of the way, let's talk about this installment. Now, after the very inarguable success of 28 Days Later, it was very apparent that we were going to have a sequel, that it was guaranteed. And when this sequel did eventually come about, the biggest difference that ended up coming out of it was Danny Boyle didn't return to direct this film. So Juan Carlos Fresnadillo ended up taking over for this film, and little insert right here. I looked up how to pronounce that name. I still don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. So please bear with me if I'm mispronouncing and butchering his name. I very deeply apologize about that. I think Fresnadillo did a very good job taking over this film, but I do think there are aspects in this film where you can feel the absence of Danny Boyle in this film as well, and a lot of it has to come from the direction and the way the camera looks, and a lot of the editing used in this movie as well, which I will get into. The emotional weight in this movie as well don't seem to be as sharp, and the scale in this film is much bigger, taking place entirely in this London city essentially, but a lot of that trades any depth for our characters, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as intimate as the previous installment. By no means, though, is this a bad sequel by any stretch of the word. I wouldn't call it that at all. It is a good follow-up to a very good movie, but also in many aspects, I feel like it plays it safe and doesn't try to take any risks. And I think that them waiting over 5 years to drop this film and not having Danny Boyle return to the director's seat and then hiring on a new staff of writers to write this film, I think it ends up making it feel not as special and good as the original installment. But before I get too ahead of myself, I should drop what the plot of this film is for you guys. Now, this film picks up 6 months after the original outbreak. The rage virus has supposedly run its course as seen at the end of the previous film, with infected, starving, and dying out, and the US Army steps in to help rebuild and repopulate parts of London. Refugees start coming back. Naturally, things don't stay safe for long when young siblings Tammy and Andy break protocol to find a photograph of their mother, and the result is a reintroduction of the rage virus into the safe zone. Right off the bat, the opening sequence in this film is one of the strongest scenes in this movie. I mean, it has the iconic song from the first film, "In the House in a Heartbeat," so what more can I say there, really? You're shown a group of survivors who are holed up in a countryside cottage when the infected suddenly break in. It's a very fast and it's a very tense scene, and it leads to two characters, Dawn and Alice, who I'm going to talk about throughout this review, who are husband and wife, and she ends up getting cornered by a whole bunch of the infected. And Don ends up panicking, and his flight or fight kicks in, and he chooses flight, and he essentially abandons her and leaves her behind. I've seen in a lot of reviews too, where people talk about how he is a very clear villain in this story. I think this very much leans into the very nihilistic take, though, that this entire movie has. Don very much just has a human reaction to a situation where most people wouldn't even begin to know how to react in the first place. So, though I don't think it is the morally right thing to do for him to abandon his wife the way he did, I mean, obviously, but I can't really blame the guy either, because you can say not being in that situation, you wouldn't do that. But if you haven't been in that situation, do you really know that you're not going to end up doing something like that? Immediately after abandoning her, you see him sprinting away from the scene as a whole bunch of the infected are chasing after him. And this is a shot that I find to be very well done, and I feel like orchestrates some of the shaky camera work in this film that I think does work well. What doesn't work well in this opening sequence for me, though, and it's something that you see throughout this entire movie, is these jump cuts that they do constantly whenever you see people getting attacked by the zombies. It's very prevalent even in this opening sequence, as I said. When you see the infected break in, they end up biting one of the girls that's in the cottage, And it happens so quickly in the way the cuts are done that it feels very disorienting, but it's to a very detrimental effect, is what I would think of it. This was very peak edgy for edge's sake era filmmaking in the early 2000s. You see it in a lot of films. And in some movies, I think it works really well. What popularized it, I think, was like the Saw franchise, and I enjoy it in those movies. But more often than not, I am not a big fan of that type of filmmaking. Like I said, I find it more disorienting than anything else, and it kind of pulls me out of the story a little bit. And that's one of my biggest gripes I have with this film, because this wasn't really prevalent in the first installment, but it's very prevalent here. You even have this later scene where Andy is locked up in this room with all these other survivors. The infected end up breaking into the room and start ravenously going after this crowd of people. The scene is very tense on paper. In fact, I don't hate it, but the way that it's edited, it just feels very messy and sloppy to me. And this very much could be a nitpick that I have on my own for this movie. And it could also be because of the high esteem that I hold that first film to. But a lot of the stuff that's going on with the editing, the way the story is done throughout this whole movie, I very much find to be more of your run-of-the-mill zombie story. And like I said, I feel like it kind of misses the point of what the original film was. And that's something that you're going to hear me say a lot in this review, is I feel like there's a lot of stuff where this movie very much does a really good job, but as a sequel to 28 Days Later, I don't think it holds a candle to it. Which also leads into another thought I have about this movie. I think this one leans a lot more into horror action, whereas the first one I would say was just a direct horror film through and through. The emotional core of the movie, I feel like there's certain aspects where it shines through very well, but overall, I don't think that's what this movie is grounded on, is the emotional core of these characters, because you have characters like Mark in the previous film, who really is only in the movie for a small chunk, but I do feel like his small chunk of the film was very impactful, especially that monologue that he gives about what happened to his family when the outbreak initially broke out. I found to be very heartbreaking and made his character all the more memorable, and it was also that much more gut-wrenching when you see him die only a scene later. I thought that was done very well, but this film, the characters aren't that. They all feel very one note for the most part. There's only two standouts in this movie for me, and that is Andy and Tammy. They are the siblings in this movie, and I'm very much a sucker for sibling dynamics. I thought they did a really good job with those two, but everyone else felt gettable to me. In fact, I had to look up names for other characters to even remember who they were, like Don and Alice, who I mentioned a second ago, that open this film. They are the mother and father to them, and there's a lot of aspects to their characters that I enjoy. I even enjoy the subplot with those two, but I also feel like it could have been utilized and done better as well. The movie really does shine, though, is the larger scale of the city and seeing all of these above shots of London, especially when you see the government take full control over the city once the virus again breaks out in this refugee camp. A lot of the shots they show of the above city are very beautifully shot, but also very horrifying at the same time. I think it is some of the best horror elements in this film, is in those moments when you see the government decide to blow up the cities so that they can try to contain the infection. I think that's done very well. You have this shot where you see all the city streets just blowing to smithereens as you see the infected running, and then what survivors couldn't escape the city in time also getting caught up in the blaze. Then you have later in the movie where you see that the military floods the city with gas, which is very, very visually striking as well. It's also one of the more enjoyable sequences in the movie, where you have our last group of survivors getting into a car, trying to avoid inhaling and getting caught in the gas, while one of the survivors ends up getting out and pushing the car, trying to help them escape, and he ends up sacrificing himself so they can get away. But it ends up turning into this group of characters trying to go down all these different city blocks, trying to avoid getting caught back up into the fumes, and again is one of the more memorable sequences of the film for me. Another part of this film that kind of makes me raise a brow though is the way the infection is handled in this one versus the previous one. It feels a lot more theatrical to me and almost cartoony. I'm not the biggest fan of it, and it pulled me out of it. It felt like it wasn't grounded as much realism. Just for example, when you jump to the outbreak of the infection at the refugee camp, you have Alice, who earlier in the film you assume that she died in that opening sequence after Dawn left her for dead. But Andy and Tammy end up finding her, and she has been bitten, but she hasn't turned, so you have all these scientists looking at her, and it's a very interesting added layer to the story when they find out that she is infected with the virus, but she is not turning, that she is in fact just a carrier of said virus. I think it's very good world building, adding that little bit in there. But something that they talk about in that scene where they're talking about it, and this is something that I thought was well done before I get into my negative about the infected, is they talk about how she's a carrier, she's not showing any signs. Her saliva and her blood are just as dangerous to come in contact with as they would be with a normal infected person as well. To backtrack to what I was saying, you end up having Dawn, who discovers that she's alive, and he ends up breaking security protocol and going to see her. And when he goes and sees her, they have this little bit of a reunion, and it seems like she forgives him, and he goes in and kisses her, and they literally swap spit, which obviously leads to him getting infected with the virus. He doesn't have a natural immunity to it like she does. When you're seeing him changing, it's very horrifying, and I like the build-up for that. I think it's very well done, especially as you see Alice thrashing about in this hospital bed, tied down, unable to escape. But that's when it veers off course for me, is after he turns, and where I get frustrated with infected Dawn for the rest of the movie a little bit. This leads to him running around and bashing people's heads in constantly, and it also leads to him gouging their eyes out. It feels very cartoonishly brutal to me in many moments, and I'm not the biggest fan of it. And again, I keep saying it, I think the first one was so grounded in realism with the way they handled the infected people in it, where this one doesn't feel like that to me. The film also ends up ending on a pretty big cliffhanger. The ending of this movie isn't bad, but it is frustrating in retrospect when you've read news about the upcoming sequels for this film. But at the end of the film, you have Andy and Tammy, who are being protected by one of the scientists and a military man, because they both know that these kids could hold the answer to a cure for the virus. Because their mom was immune, they might have the same immunity. It's discovered towards the end of the movie that Andy in fact does. He ends up getting bit by his father, and when Tammy goes and saves him, he does not turn, but he gets the pigmentation to one of his eyes, just like his mother did, of someone that is infected, but he himself doesn't start to act like an infected person. And it ends with the two of them getting into this helicopter, Tammy lying about him being bitten. Jump cuts to a little bit later, and you see that the helicopter's crashed. You don't see Andy or Tammy, and then it shows Paris being overrun by zombies immediately after, and then the film cuts to black. It's not a bad ending by any means, but a lot of the press articles I have been reading about the upcoming sequels have been discussing how they're essentially going to sidestep this movie, that it's still going to exist in universe. I think it was very confusing what I was reading. It was very back and forth. If someone understands the situation a little bit better, then by all means put it in the comments down below. But I find it kind of frustrating that we are ditching those characters, because this movie isn't a bad movie by any means. I know I've been kind of harsh on it, but like I said, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the movie that it's following up to, I think, is next to perfect. And this one is, again, your very typical zombie story. And I, too, want to see a happy ending for these two sibling characters. Like I said, I'm a total sucker for seeing a cute sibling dynamic in a movie. And I am not the biggest fan of this very nihilistic ending that we end up getting, because this entire movie is kind of a downer through and through. You don't see really anything good or happy happen to these characters, even these two kids. You just want them to catch a break constantly. When you see them pulling up in a train, see their parents who they haven't seen for God knows how long since this infection broke out. You have them getting to their dad and then finding out that their mom's dead and then finding out that their dad lied about what happened to their mom at the beginning of the movie, only for their dad to die and then their mom to die, and they are left alone with only each other. They only have each other. Like, it's very, very heartbreaking stuff, and I would love to see a happy ending for them. Getting a happy ending for them, I feel like would be way more in touch with what the original movie was. That is very much something I heavily praised in that first film, was the happy ending that they did end up using in it. They had ideas for multiple other more downbeat endings, but they eventually ended up going with something more hopeful, which I thought was very good for that film, especially for the times that it came out, and I very much appreciated that take. I wish this movie would have followed up with that, because this movie, it continues with themes of government overpower and of what human reactions would be in such a high-stress situation, but there's no hope behind it. You don't have characters like Hannah and Frank giving you hope. You don't have characters that end up flipping a leaf like Celine and realizing that not everything has to be all bad. It's not like that at all. It's a very hopeless film, and that's something that I just kind of find to be disappointing about this installment in the franchise. Is I don't think that they should have went so heavily into that. And part of the reason I want them to come back so bad in this franchise as well is Imogen, who played Tammy, she expressed interest back in 2020 that she would come back and play her character again. If she's down for it, then like, why not sign her up, man? Like, have her come back. That would be great. And I think so many people would be down with that. Because by all means, this isn't a bad movie. It doesn't need to be forgotten. They don't need to re-full treatment it or even sidestep it as like a side movie or whatever. Like, it would be really cool if we had both Tammy and Andy running around in a future installment, because really they are our only survivors in this film anyways. So it shouldn't be that hard to like just write them in somewhere and bring them back organically. But to sidestep the review aspects of this video, and if you've seen my other videos, you guys know that I just can't help myself but to talk about some viral marketing campaigns. 28 days before the release of this film in the UK, they flashed this huge biohazard sign against the white cliffs of Dover. And below the biohazard sign that they decided to flash up there, it said "Contaminated, keep out." I think that's a really fun addition, especially with the 28 days before its release. I keep telling you guys in all these videos, I am a sucker for a good viral marketing campaign. But ultimately, this film didn't end up being as much of a financial success as that first movie. That first movie very much caught lightning in a bottle. But what it did end up making in the box office was nothing to be scoffed at either. It ended up rounding up over 65 million, which ended up meaning that another sequel would be inevitable. Said sequel would remain in production hell for like well over a decade, seeing as we're just barely getting the third installment here in a couple weeks. But trust me, I will get way more into that when I inevitably end up reviewing 28 years later. To wrap up this video and give my overall thoughts, like I said, this isn't a bad movie. It's a decent follow-up. In fact, if you're a fan of the first film, go and watch this one. This sequel is very inoffensive. If I sounded negative towards it throughout this video, it's because I hold that first one in such high regard. I also don't think it's a bad movie by any stretch of the word at all, and I wouldn't try to convince you guys otherwise either. You guys should let me know what you thought of 28 Weeks Later, and if you think that I'm being too harsh on it, leave a comment down below and tell me your opinions. Or if you feel the same way that I did, like, I'd love to hear that down below too. Sorry if I was like a little too harsh on this movie as well, like I keep saying, but I want to keep things real on this channel and what my opinions are. I'm not going to try to front you guys if I like something or dislike something here. Like, I want to give my very honest take. whether it be popular or unpopular. Like, I don't care. I want to be as legit as I can about things. It goes without saying as well, though, that I won't be releasing any more videos in this series until I eventually go see 28 Years Later in theaters, so stay tuned for that. And if you want to see that eventual video, subscribe to this channel. I would love to have you guys. And if you have any other recommendations for any other franchises that you want me to cover, leave that in the comments right down below. I would love to hear them. And if you just have any solo movie reviews that you want me to do or cover, I'm all ears for that. I say it in every video at this point. I cover everything and anything horror on this channel. But anyways, this has been Justice, and I really hope to see you guys on the next one. Take care.